Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. Let me tell you what our format is going to be tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit to start about the Abraham Lincoln transition to the presidency. And then the governor is going to talk a bit about the current transition to the presidency, parallels, differences, whatever is on his mind. Then we'll dialogue a little bit because while I've been trained to agree with everything he says, he doesn't agree with anything I say. And then we'll let you ask some questions. Hopefully we'll have time for you to join the discussion. Well, the night he was elected president, a relatively inexperienced, lanky, big-eared candidate from Illinois who had defeated the senator from New York for his party's nomination after a grueling and divisive fight, sat with his friends as the votes came in and reacted this way: "God help me." His name was Abraham Lincoln. The night he was elected president, a relatively inexperienced, lanky, big-eared candidate from Illinois who had defeated the senator from New York for his party's nomination after a grueling fight, said in effect, "Abraham Lincoln help me." This is what Barack Obama declared, and I quote, "As Lincoln said to a nation far more divided than ours, we are not enemies but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." There's actually double irony here because those words from Lincoln were actually drafted by the senator from New York who thought he was going to be president. Not quite those words, because one of the reasons maybe that William Seward didn't become president is that he couldn't write like Abraham Lincoln. This is fascinating. This is the words that Seward suggested. "Although passion has strained our bonds of affection too hardly, they must not, I am sure they will not be broken." Out of that kind of earnest but prosaic sentiment came, "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." And that's the difference, I think, between talent and genius, between an idea and inspiration. Well, I'm going to leave Senator Obama to the governor. I would like to point out something very comforting that's come to light in the last few days, and that's the fact that at least it's comforting for me, the January 20th, 2009 inaugural has officially been themed for Abraham Lincoln. This was Senator Feinstein's idea with Senator Obama, and they haven't decided how this is going to manifest itself. We'll see, but for Senator Obama, like Lincoln, it's all about the words, so I have a feeling it will be the words that will be emphasized. And of course, the links that are so interesting and the parallels represent a story whose ending has not been written yet. But I think we all recognize that the opening chapters of this current story have helped complete what Abraham Lincoln in Gettysburg in 1863 and what Mario Cuomo in Gettysburg in 1991 called America's unfinished work, closing one chapter of American history even as it opens another. Anyway, time is short. My time alone is short, so I do want to talk a bit about the Lincoln transition, the period that was known as, and is the subtitle of my book, the Great Secession Winter of 1860-1861, when all hell broke loose. But what I'm going to do, and what the book tries to show, is that Lincoln's reputation as president-elect, which has been very low, certainly compared to that of his presidency, deserves a re-examination, that in fact he did a much better job than we've given him credit for. But let me start with the challenges that he faced after Election Day. Okay, I'm going to just run off with these bullet by bullet. One, he had a clear electoral majority, but he only won 39% of the popular vote. It was the most lopsided regional election in history. Lincoln won only about 3% or 2% of the votes in the southern states where his name was allowed to be on the ballot. In 10 states, his name wasn't on the ballot. Even in the North, which he swept, save for New Jersey, we all know that's always a problem, He only got 56%, 55, 56% of the vote in the North, so 45% of the North was also arrayed against him. 60% of the country was against him. His election wasn't secure on Election Day, even though he got this clear electoral majority. He felt, and his aides, his friends felt, that it was entirely possible that the state electors who met on December 5th in their various state capitals would not ratify this vote, and that the Electoral College that convened in Washington in February would do something to upset the apple cart. Lincoln himself thought that the great danger to his presidency was in the Electoral College. What if the South doesn't come? What if there's no quorum? What if something happens? So he was never even certain about his election. Of course, 7 states reacted to his election by quitting, by leaving the Union between December and February. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. What followed was the seizure of federal property in southern states and the indifference of the incumbent president. At best indifference. He also added hostility. In those days, the sitting president got one last State of the Union address, then known as the annual message. Buchanan gave an annual message that said, the states are all leaving the Union. It's not the southern states' fault. It's the fault of the Republican Party. They did it. At best, Lincoln has an alternative president, Jefferson Davis, elected in February to be president of this alternative government, the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. And at the moment that Lincoln has been yearning for and planning his inaugural journey that he hopes will be his greatest triumph, Jefferson Davis undertakes an equally publicized journey from Mississippi to Alabama to assume the presidency. With all this, with all of these challenges, Lincoln had no advisory infrastructure. He didn't have a Rahm Emanuel who he appointed on day one. He had a staff of 2, a German-born clerk, professional clerk, who was ever thus in the rest of his career, a former newspaper editor from Illinois. He appointed a deputy, John Hay, who later became a famous Secretary of State under McKinley and TR, but that was it. That was the staff. No email, of course, no telephones. The communication challenges were vast. He had to stay in touch with the Republican leaders in Washington, but could only do so through private and confidential letters. Difficult, time-consuming. During this period, both the House and the Senate offer compromise plans to thwart the Republican platform, to take the initiative away from the president-elect before he becomes president. A peace convention meets in Washington at the Willard Hotel. When he gets to Washington, he finds that there's a peace convention going on, trying to subvert his incoming administration and pass a constitutional amendment that would have enshrined slavery forever and extended slavery west to California. He has to fight that, even as he's registering in the hotel and throwing out the delegate who was occupying the hotel suite he was supposed to occupy. Guess what state he was from? New York. A bombardment of job seekers. You know, he had open office hours. Open office hours. People lined up, and from 9 to 11 every day, they came in and asked for favors. They threatened him. And speaking of threats, daily death threats, and yet no real security until he leaves for Washington, when he had a record kind of security. Demands that he speak out, conciliate the South, and demands that he be quiet, because if he conciliates the South, he gets the North upset. If he's too hostile, he gets the Northern Democrats upset. He has the most fragile of coalitions. Well, just speak out, his friends say, and say you're not going to do any harm. And he said, I won't be sycophantic. I won't beg for the privilege that this election has given me. I won't be a sucked egg, all shell and no substance in it. By the way, during this period, Lincoln's wife, unlike Mrs. Obama, goes on the road to New York and begins agitating for her own choices for the cabinet. And in one moment, she's seen in their home in Springfield. Somebody comes to visit him to ask for a job, and he stumbles into the parlor, and there is Mrs. Lincoln on the floor, face down. And Lincoln sitting forlornly in his chair, and the man says, I beg your pardon, Mr. Lincoln, I hope everything's all right. He said, oh, it's just Mrs. Lincoln. She said that she's not going to get up off the floor unless the person she wants to be a postmaster is appointed. No speechwriters, no seclusion, barely any. He has to hide above his brother-in-law's store to write his inaugural address, which he wrote above a grocery store, Governor. No access to his predecessor until he gets to Washington. 1,000 miles of travel. Of course, he didn't just take a plane to his inauguration. 1,000 miles of travel, speeches at every state capital, at every legislature, from Indianapolis to Columbus to Albany to Trenton to Philadelphia and Harrisburg, all the way to Washington. Despite all of these challenges, despite this lingering myth that he vacillated and hid during the secession winter, I think he did an astonishing number of things with all of this daily pressure, everything happening concurrently. And very briefly, he refused to give in on slavery. He could have compromised. He could have said, let the Peace Convention take the blame for it. But he wouldn't do it, because any compromise that invited the southern states back in would have basically enshrined slavery for another 50 years. He created somehow, not even knowing the people he was appointing, one of the most brilliant administrations, as Doris Goodwin has shown, ever assembled for a cabinet. He politically remade the government class through the power of appointments, which was important because he got 20 years of pro-slavery Democrats out of the federal bureaucracy. He crafted some brilliant speeches for his journey, culminating in one of the great inaugural addresses in American history, somewhat overshadowed by his second, but quite brilliant as well. And he created, in the bargain, a new image as a wise and avuncular bearded statesman, somehow readier for the crisis than the rail splitter who had won the election. And most remarkable of all to me, when he passes through Baltimore in secrecy, en route to Washington, on the final leg of this 11-day journey, which he's tried to plan so carefully, but is convinced he has to sneak through Baltimore, maybe even wearing a disguise, to arrive safely, to evade a credible assassination plot. He somehow maintains or regains his bearings, poses for photographers, goes publicly to church, meets with Democrats, calls on the president, calls on Congress, receives all three of his election opponents at the Willard Hotel, calls on Chief Justice Roger Taney, his lifelong, 10-year-long enemy, the author of the hated Dred Scott decision, and somehow, within a week after the Baltimore disaster, regains the respect of the North, able to take control of the country. That was Lincoln's secession winter, and we're still in the autumn of Senator Obama, but with that, I will hand it off to a man who knows transitions, Governor Cuomo.
Thank you very much, Harold. Let me get something clear at the very beginning. Harold and I worked together for a long time, and we've been friends for a long time. He tells you that he has been trained to believe what I say. Well, the truth is, tonight he told me what to say. And I'm going to do only a little bit of what he asked me to do. Among other things, Harold has said that Lincoln refused to give in to slavery, and extending slavery, that is. And of course, that's true. But we have to keep in mind, he also didn't say anything about ending slavery. As a matter of fact, he made a very strong point throughout his early years as president, reminding people that he didn't have the power to end slavery. And so we have to keep that in mind. There are significant similarities and some significant differences, I think, between Lincoln and Obama. One of the small differences is that Lincoln had 117 days to deal with between his election and his swearing in, while Obama has only 77 days. I think that's more an advantage than a disadvantage for Obama. The chores that Lincoln dealt with, as you've heard some of them from Harold, selecting a cabinet, selecting a staff, drafting an inaugural address, and his attention to party matters, to political matters, are all tasks that Obama is confronted with as well. The biggest difference to me between Obama's period now, between election and swearing in, and Lincoln's is the nature of the issues that confronted the two of them. You've heard Harold tell you the problems that, or the challenges, what Harold's word, that Lincoln faced, and indeed there were many of them. But basically they came down to two things. One was the formidable challenge of the demand for the extension of slavery. And so the one thing he had to deal with was his position on slavery and their position on slavery. And the other thing was how to keep the Union together while that argument was going on, an argument that was to become a law. Obama, on the other hand, has dozens of extremely serious issues facing him immediately. And that difference, the difference between the seriousness of the many problems Obama is facing and what Lincoln was confronted with, was the difference was most evident in Lincoln's masterful inaugural, which was all about slavery and preserving the Union and nothing else. As a matter of fact, in writing the speech, Lincoln dismissed all the other issues that he might be facing at the very top of the speech, considering them as lacking in his words, anxiety or excitement. So Lincoln was all about those two questions that were really a tandem. The one, slavery, and people who are importuning him to do this and do that about slavery, guaranteeing that it would remain, et cetera, et cetera. He had to deal with that, but at the same time, he had to try to keep the Union together in making that stand. Obama, on the other hand, faces two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, a threatened third war with Iran. He also needs to stay focused on the ongoing struggle with world terrorism by keeping us safe from another attack, which we must concede the Bush administration has done successfully since 9/11. At the same time, he must deal with our worst financial and economic problems since the Great Depression. Lincoln didn't speak out on the questions that were troubling him in that period, according to some Lincoln scholars, because he was confused about what to do and didn't understand the real dangers of secession. Some of the most lauded of the historians who focus on Lincoln have taken that position. Harold, on the other hand, has taken a different view. And I suspect, knowing Harold and after reading his book, that after the world has read his book, some of those experts will be converted to his more favorable view of Lincoln's silence. As a matter of fact, I think David Donald has indicated that while Donald's own book on Lincoln is already a classic, at least in my opinion, and he's very clear in his book about what he thought about Lincoln's period as a failure and a bad start to the presidency. Well, I think I understand he's been convinced by Harold to take another look at that, and that's all to Harold's credit. Obama, like Lincoln, acknowledges that we have only one president at a time. He's said that already 4 or 5 times, but he's already chosen to speak out to assure, and he's spoken out very clearly, especially to people around the world, but to people around the country and the world. He has said he will continue to pursue the federal remedies that have been invented to deal with our financial and economic calamities. But he's spoken out on foreign policy, I think, even more interestingly. He has made the point that he's going to meet with the Muslim world, which I was delighted to hear, because for years now we've been trying to make the point that there are 1 billion Muslims, and the jihadists, who are the terrorists, are only a very tiny, tiny percentage of that. And so Obama has indicated that he wishes to convene a meeting of the Muslim world, and he will be present at it, trying to recruit them to assist in dealing with the handful, comparatively, of troublesome jihadists who they regard as a desecration of the Koran in their activities. It's fair to say that Lincoln's period in history certainly produced serious problems to deal with, but more than a century of globalization since then has produced a whole lot of other huge, much larger problems for Obama. Just think a little bit about it. World wars, the ugly birth of nuclear weapons, which we will have to take credit for, and now the proliferation of those weapons of mass destruction, which are threatening the entire globe, as is global warming, world poverty, pandemic disease, all of this happening at the same time in this country and around the world. And so this is a much more dangerous world than the one Lincoln was born to. Lincoln, like Obama, needed assistance with foreign policy and turned to his early opponent, Governor Seward, as you've heard. Obama has not yet chosen his Secretary of State, but it may very well be a former opponent, at least with respect to what party they're in. He may very well select a Republican, and a number of Republican possibilities have been suggested. Senators Lugar and Hagel, and even Robert Gates, who is now Secretary of Defense, has been mentioned as a possibility for Secretary of State. If not, it's also been suggested that perhaps he'll keep Gates on, and I hope he does, not just because that gives us a little evidence of his bipartisanship, which is something that I think is good and useful, and he has promised. The two presidents-elect are similar in their desire to be bipartisan, and I think that's a very good thing. I mean, the one thing that both of them did, and this is a point that I think we should think more and more about nowadays, is that rigid ideology is ridiculous and an obstruction to common sense and progress. My own position has been for a long time that while there is a place for ideology in a very broad way, some major commitments to taking care of the poor, etc., the test for whether or not your governmental activity is a good thing or a bad thing should come down to common sense and benign pragmatism. You should take every issue as it arises and consider it on its own merits instead of applying some ideological test to it. And I say benign pragmatism because with a name like Mario Cuomo, if you say simply pragmatism, they think you're Machiavelli. And people are confused. They believe pragmatism is a bad thing. Pragmatism is not a bad thing. Pragmatism means it works. So I add the word benign to mean it works to help good people around the world. And both of them, I think, have felt that way. A number of Republican possibilities have been named. I told you about it. Lincoln and Obama also thought of themselves as someone preparing to be president because neither of them had real executive experience. Both were incredibly gifted personally with high intelligence and extraordinary speaking ability. I've said of Obama, he is the best combination of God's gifts in a politician that I've witnessed in my lifetime. Both had vice presidents. Lincoln had Hamlin, who was, I guess, Harold would agree, a non-factor. But Obama's Biden clearly has proved already to be a consequential choice. There's one difference between the two that has not been highlighted as far as I can tell, and I have noticed it, and it discomforts me. Lincoln, I remember in a debate with Gingrich, I think it was in 2004, Charlie Rose, who was the moderator of the debate, said to the audience and to me that that Gingrich maintains that George Bush was very, very religious, and he had a Bible, and he spoke about the Bible, and George Bush was always talking about God and going to church, et cetera, and that was just like Lincoln. And he said, "Isn't that so, Governor?" And I said, "Well, I don't think it's so. I mean, Lincoln referred a lot to God and even to Christ, but he wasn't really religious. And and he referred to talking even to God. But the difference between Bush and Lincoln when it came to relationships with God was that Lincoln was saying he talked to God. Bush was saying God talked to Bush." And that's a very big difference. And frankly, if that was true, I don't think he understood her. Now, but here, getting serious about it, Obama says he is a true believer, a Christian true believer. And that's fine with me, except that he goes on to say, and that's why he can't be for same-sex marriage. Now, when you say you're a true believer, well, that's fine and suitable to our democracy. Everybody's free. The First Amendment gives us that right, thank God, to say things like thank God if we wish to. On the other hand, when you say that that's the reason for my policy, then what you're suggesting is a violation at least of the spirit of the First Amendment, because you shouldn't be making laws on the basis of your religious belief alone, and I underscore alone. And that's what Obama appears to be saying, that same-sex marriage, I won't call it marriage because that violates my religion. That is precisely the position that the current President Bush has taken with respect to embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are cherished now by science. They think that they're very valuable things, and they've asked the president, the scientists have, and many of the rest of us have, for help in finding ways to work with embryonic stem cells. And the president's position has been, no, I will not cooperate. And as a matter of fact, Obama said he will change that position because it's a position that wasn't done by law but by a presidential mandate. He says, I can't do that because my religion prevents me from doing it, because my religion tells me human life begins at conception. And if that's true, it changes everything with respect to abortion, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very important point. Somehow it has slipped past us, I think, in the race, because no one's made a point of it. I'm making a point of it now, and I will continue to. Lincoln is thought of by many as the greatest president we ever had. Obama is thought of by many as having the potential to be another great president, and even without doing more. Obama's victory on November 4th, 2008, will forever be considered a significant elaboration of Lincoln's eventual triumph over slavery's unfairness and oppressiveness, which happened really after Lincoln, but only because of Lincoln. And I think then, for the rest, I think we have to get back to Harold to see what other things he wants me to say. Thank you very much.
Well, can I take issue with a few things you said?
You certainly can, but
right.
Be gentle.
All right. Let me just do one parallel that I forgot to talk about, which is sort of interesting. 2 weeks before he left for, well, let me start it another way. 2 days before the election, about 2 days, Senator Obama went back to his childhood home to visit the woman who, not his mother, but the woman who raised him, for a tearful reunion, knowing that it was the last time he would see her. And we all know how poignant that was and what happened. It was the last time. She passed away tragically the day before her grandson was elected president. A week before leaving for Washington, Lincoln went back to his, well, not childhood home, but his young adult home on the prairie in Illinois, and there had a tearful reunion with the woman, not his mother, who had raised him, his stepmother, Sarah. And he probably suspected, as she was nearing 80 years old, that it would be the last time he would see her. She tugged at his sleeve when he was leaving and said, I know it's the last time I'll see you because I know they're going to kill you. Oh. And that was their last meeting. So it's sort of another parallel we can put in the book. You took an interesting twist on things by saying only 77 days to prepare. That's a negative for Obama, that he's only got 77 days. Lincoln was so itching to go to Washington, he found it unbearable. He said at times that he'd like to hang himself because he was so anxious, he was so angry that, and then he changed his mind and said it's Buchanan who should be hanged because he's allowing the federal property to be seized before he can get there. He was petrified that the Congress, the lame duck Congress, and this crazy peace convention would undermine the Republican platform, which people took platforms quite seriously in those days, and enact an extension of slavery all the way to the Pacific, which would include all areas below, meaning the potential annexation of Cuba, the annexation of Mexico, Lower Mexico, and other areas to add to the slave empire, which would have perpetuated slavery and Southern dominance in Congress in behalf of the slave interest forever. I mean, there was no end in sight. And whether Lincoln did it because he hated slavery, because he hated the Democrats' control on the Congress, he hated it and he didn't want it to be done. You know, imagine if well, there is another parallel. I'm jumping a little, but President Bush said, and I think he had all good intentions, that he was going to have a World Economic Summit. I think it starts next week. And he said whoever wins the presidency is invited to attend the World Economic Summit. And I said to myself, when I heard it, Lincoln never would have done it. FDR wouldn't do it. He would not enter any compacts or conversations with Hoover on substantive issues, even though people were petrified, as they are now, and as they were then. Obama, by the way, has said he, you know, as you pointed out, Gov, with respect, President Bush is the president, and he declines, with respect, to attend the economic summit. So Lincoln gets to Washington. The head of the Peace Convention is one of 5 vexatious living presidents, none of whom have a good thing to say about Abraham Lincoln, ex-presidents, including the guy who becomes chairman of the Peace Convention, John Tyler of Virginia, a slaveholder, whose greatest achievement in life was that he, even as president, he was an accidental president, was that he was the father of 19 children. That was his major accomplishment. When he gets to the Peace Convention, he's elected not chairman, but president of the Peace Convention.
How many wives did he
2.
have? 2?
I knew you'd ask that. I was ready.
Well, I think the wives deserve more of the credit.
One died, as you would expect. So he has this Peace Convention. He has to meet them at Willard's Hotel and establish himself with them and make it clear he's not going to acquiesce. He also had something of a financial crisis. I just want to add to his burdens, because you've made the point that you think Obama is more burdened. He had a financial crisis. The stock market declined when Lincoln was elected.
Are you saying you don't think Obama has more burdens?
I'm saying I don't think Obama has more burdens.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. A possible war, 2 ongoing wars, possibility of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and they're all over Russia. All we need is one bad argument. The Israelis have dropped another bomb on Syria. If they do it in Iran, you may have a world war. And
Lincoln
you
had
still
weapons
think
of,
Lincoln, but
Lincoln not only had weapons of mass destruction, obviously for the time they were considered.
It was like misdestruction. Yeah.
He was a big fan of military technology. This guy who didn't even like to shoot a rifle.
But he didn't
allowed
have, he didn't have a
ironclads.
nuclear weapon.
He had, this kind of acid rain kind of fire that was just considered to be grotesquely inappropriate. He encouraged it. He had ironclad battleships built here in Brooklyn and Greenpoint to level unheard of warfare. Gatling guns.
I'm getting closer
Everything
and
is
closer to
relative.
Donald's original position. No, let me. But you before you go.
What Obama didn't have is the nation dissolving. He had the red and the blue, which he's putting together. Lincoln had the blue and the gray, which is a lot harder.
You said 77 days is something that Lincoln would have been pleased to have,
right,
instead of the 117. It's interesting. I'm not sure that it's an advantage or a disadvantage to Obama to have 77 days. Sometimes I feel it would be better if he had only 7. There are practical reasons, because there's so much work to do, and everybody knows there's so much work to do, that I'd like to see him get on with the work as soon as possible. On the other hand, normally you'd need a whole lot of days just to pick your cabinet and staff, because they have to be looked at very carefully. You have to do inspections, et cetera, et cetera. That is not happening. Although Obama ran on a change, and ran specifically against Hillary Clinton by saying she was the old politics, which meant that she and her husband were the old politics. He has started by using mostly Clinton people. Mm-hmm. And so he is staffing up with John Podesta and Rahm Emanuel, and Larry Summers and all of these people who worked for Clinton. Now, I think that's a good thing because you need experience. It also shortens the need for time because these are people who have been looked at carefully before. So there's, I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I hope that, and I suspect that Obama may, before the end of the period, start being a lot more overt in what he intends to do, because they're having a dispute already between himself and President Bush on how exactly to handle the bailout package and whether or not to give money to General Motors, et cetera, et cetera. So that remains to be seen. But I don't think he's going to go this whole 77 days without being very much more active.
And there's much more communications demand now. They obviously, the idea that Lincoln would have held a press conference 3 days after his election was just not part of the political culture in 1860. Silence was the tradition. He had done no campaigning for the presidency, which was an interesting phenomenon. He was silent from the time he spoke in New York at Cooper Union and gave those ancillary speeches in New England to the time he left Springfield. Very few talks because the tradition respected silence and the dignity of the presidency. I just want to make one other point about, I mean, obviously the crises are relative, the destructiveness of weapons is relative. Lincoln could not have imagined what was to become available in the 21st century, just as George Washington could never have imagined what kind of weaponry would be brought to the fore in the Civil War. But Lincoln it's never recognized, or it's seldom recognized, that Lincoln did have a bit of a foreign policy crisis. It's gotten short shrift because of the crisis of the nation facing the nation itself and its structure. But as soon as they started banding about this idea of extending the Missouri Compromise and looking southward for more territory, Lincoln got one diplomatic visit in his entire interregnum, and that was Benito Juarez's minister from Mexico, who came all the way to Springfield, Illinois, to see Lincoln and assure him of the loyalty of the people of Mexico to the justly elected leader of the United States. But that's not all. His name was Matias Romero. I love that name. He also was worried about England and France, knowing, as soon as secession started, just as the loyal city of New York and its mayor immediately said, we're going to secede too and become an independent city-state so we can keep up trade with the South, which was on the mind of Mayor Fernando Wood. Just as that was happening, Lincoln was contemplating losing Britain and France as reliable trade allies, maybe even becoming a military threat again to the United States. So he was walking a delicate line in foreign policy too. It's been very little studied and underemphasized.
Now, you would know, certainly you know better than I, but better than most of us, including most of the experts. Lincoln, I was always fascinated by how Lincoln spoke about the importance of the American experience with democracy and keeping it all together and not losing it, how that was important to the whole world, and how for all the days to come after Lincoln, he said, you know, we can impress this lesson on the entire globe. And he kept insisting on that we're not speaking just for this moment or just for this nation, but for the whole world.
But for all time to come.
I mean, that was a kind of startling foresight, don't you think?
I do, and he said it with increasing passion and emphasis as he finished some of his less successful inaugural journey speeches and got to the East Coast. I think he was inspirited by being in the places where the Founding Fathers had been. When he gets to Trenton, he talks about the original idea, something we fought for that could light the future generations. I think there was a little political calculation to it too, because a lot of his coalition was made up of refugees from the wars of 1848 in Europe. He had a big German-American following, and America's role as a beacon to the world was crucial to those people who harbored hopes of returning home.
How did the rest of the world react to his election?
Total perplexity. By
Really?
the time the news reached England and France, I mean, a wonderful comment by a British aristocrat was, I'm looking at the portraits of the two American presidents, this dignified-looking man from Kentucky and this other slob from Kentucky. And I must say, judging by the photographs, one looks like a president and the other looks like a farmer. Sir Alexander Beresford Hope. I think the aristocrats and the working men's groups in Europe had not yet understood that Lincoln would become a friend of free labor, because they just saw him as a, sort of a bumpkin.
I think that is an immense difference between the two experiences. Now, we're just back, Matilda and I, from Italy. Matilda was there for 3 weeks. But I was astonished to see in Rome, plastered on all the walls, posters on Obama. And the people were just wild with excitement about his victory. And I'm told that's true in most of Europe and in most of the world. And they see a new reason for hope. There was something about Obama, I thought, had something very much in common with Lincoln and Roosevelt. He has this gift for great speech and great poetry. It sounds like poetry when he says it, but when you read their words, and this is true of Lincoln and Roosevelt as well, they're very simple words. They're very simple ideas, and they're almost all simple morality that you can accept. We're all in this thing together. We should all be thinking like a family. The whole world should come together. And that has caught fire around the world. I mean, even the enemies of, or people who appear to be quasi-hostile with us in this, are talking with respect about Obama and looking forward to engaging with him. But nothing like that happened for Lincoln.
It happened overseas only after the assassination, when news of his, the emancipation changed his image in Europe. Yeah. When he's murdered, and we see this explosion of portraiture here in the United States, banners and prints and photographs, it reaches overseas as well. And you see images printed of Abramo Lincoln in Italy, in which he looks like it looks like an Italian man, and the ones in England may give him very thin lips. He looks British. His image actually flowers the most in places where freedom blossoms the least. So in France, where there's a dictator, Victor Hugo and others intentionally strike a medal to Lincoln and defy the dictator. And so he does, but not until his martyrdom, not until the achievements of peace. It struck me that President Bush has done what Lincoln did in terms of making that sort of, it's almost a presumptuous assertion. It didn't sound so when I read it about Lincoln, but the idea that America had a responsibility to light the world, to be the example of democracy. I mean, obviously President Bush has done that, pursued that more aggressively than Lincoln did overseas. But and Bush always quotes Lincoln about that he learned it from Lincoln. Two
questions I have for you. This is easier than arguing with them. I ask them a question.
We have to argue about the Constitution a little bit.
You want to argue about the Constitution?
No, ask me. I like when you ask me questions, because you've never. I've known you for 30 years. You've never asked me a question.
Yeah, where were you?
Where am I? You asked me that.
Right. The Lincoln and religion. Religion's a very, very big subject. I mean, a lot bigger than some people will accept, because it impinges on so many parts of our life. And trying to figure out what the role of religion is in making policy is a very difficult time. We've invented a whole language here about culture wars, which basically means that there are people who get together as parties even and say, we're going to fight for our religion in the Congress. And they make their judgments on the basis of their religion, which is a very divisive thing, unless when you start getting exquisite about your religion and saying things like, I can just imagine the first Jewish president saying everybody's got to be kosher. It doesn't work well. So tell us about Lincoln's religion.
It was a source of, he got the same treatment that the senator-elect from North Carolina got. Charges when he first ran for Congress that he wasn't a true Christian. and he did battle in the newspapers to prove that he was not he wasn't an agnostic. But what was he? That's more to the point. He actually ran against a minister named Peter Cartwright for Congress, and he attended Cartwright's rally, and Cartwright said, "All those who are going to heaven, please stand up." And of course, everybody but 3 people who had sinned the night before stood up. He said, "All those who are going to hell, stand up." And the 3 sinners sheepishly stood up and hung their head. Everybody was standing up except Lincoln. He said, "Excuse me, I see my opponent is in the audience. Mr. Lincoln, if you're not going to heaven, you're not going to hell. May I inquire where your destination is?" And he said, "If it's all the same to you, I'm going to Congress." He never joined a church. And his wife was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Springfield. Lincoln went occasionally. He was very angry that the ministers in Springfield, his hometown, were almost unified against him. He said, how could they be the spokesman for God in our community and support a candidate who believes that human beings can be enslaved? How can that be? How can I belong to a church where that's the gospel? We've disagreed now about what happens when he becomes president. Well, we disagreed privately. He does certainly read the Bible. He takes the Bible, he absorbs it, and uses the Bible in so many speeches. The House Divided and the Second Inaugural, which is, as we've written together in a gallery note we once wrote, is a Old Testament condemnation of anyone who tolerated the sin of human slavery, right out of Leviticus, I think. But basically, his philosophy, I think he expresses it beautifully one day, and that's, when I do good, I feel good, and that's my religion. It's sort of Sermon on the Mount kind of religion. And the only time he invokes an angry God is to justify the bloodshed for the war. So it's a very complicated record. And I think he believed in fate, but he wasn't sure about God's will. As you point out, he prayed, but he didn't think God talked to him.
Yeah. This is a final thought from me, I think, because you get to hear what the audience wants to hear about. In terms of religion, I think we've missed a big opportunity to give religion its proper role in our society. Terrorism is to some extent religious because of this aberrant and I think unreasonable view that some people take of the Koran and what it means. And as I say, most of the Muslims regard the jihadists as a desecration of the Koran. But after 9/11, I remember being asked what we should do at the site, at Ground Zero. And I said, I think what you should do at the site of Ground Zero is whatever else you do, is to build an annex to the United Nations. Every governor, I included, and the governor before me and the governors after me, have been importuned by the United Nations to help them to expand, because the world is expanding and the world of representation is expanding. So they need more space. I said, use Ground Zero as an annex to the United Nations, and then put in front of it in some form pillars, and have the pillars represent each of the religions that we recognize as a nation. Now, under the First Amendment, it talks only about religion. Religion has to be defined, and it's defined by the Supreme Court. And it's defined in a way that includes atheism. The way they handle the religion in the Supreme Court is to say there are 3 theistic religions, starting with Judaism, 3 God-oriented religions: Judaism, then Christianity, born of Judaism, and then Islam, the Koran. They're all the God religion. But then there's Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and ethical humanism, which is basically atheism. And that's a religion too. So, because it's a series of rules and it's organized. Okay. Now, what you do then is look at all those religions and take their basic proposition. And you start with Judaism, and that's all you need, because Judaism has the 2 principles that we've talked about so much and written about, and that is tzedakah and tikkun olam. And tzedakah basically is see yourselves as children of the same God and treat yourself accordingly. Actually, they think of it as a matter of justice, I think. So that's tzedakah. And what is your mission? Tikkun olam. The world needs to be repaired. The world's impact. But if you go to Christ and Christianity, he comes out of the synagogue, and some of the disdainers stop him in the street and say, gee, the rabbis are all talking about what a smart guy you are. What is it you're telling them? And he says, I'm telling them a very simple thing. I said, you want to know the law? The whole law is love one another as you love yourself, for the love of me, and I'm truth. And the truth is that God made this world but didn't complete it. And you ought to be collaborators with him in creation to make it a better world and keep the creation going. And they said, yeah, but that's Judaism. And he says, I'm a Jew. You know, and Hillel, of course, says exactly the same thing. You know, love one another, etc. Everything else is commentary. So you take that, and then and the Quran says that, and every religion that the Supreme Court recognizes says it one way or another. Do unto others. It's very simple. And if you just stayed with the two basic rules of Judaism, you could govern that way. That's enough for politics. And that's where Lincoln, I think, was religious. You know, and when he spoke about religion, he spoke about it in those very simple terms.
You know, he also had tests. He could have become a know-nothing, an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant politician, and he rejected it specifically, which was unusual for his time. And at the beginning of the Civil War, when Ulysses S. Grant, a rising general, bans Jews from the Kentucky area that he commands, the rabbis, including Rabbi Wise, came to the White House and asked Lincoln to overturn the order banning Jews. And Lincoln did that at great peril because Grant was the only general who was successful. And also, he was appealed to by New York rabbis to change the law that allowed chaplains, that mandated that chaplains had to be of some legitimate Christian denomination. He had the word Christian struck from the law so that the first rabbis could be, and by that that is just further evidence of this universality that he felt about all men.
Don't you think we ought to?
Yeah, I'd love to hear
questions.
How do we do it? I guess, Gov, you want to call on? This gentleman here has a question.
You talked about Lincoln, his first inaugural, being very focused on the two key issues of preserving the Union and dealing with the slavery issue, and obviously it's related. I'd be curious of both of your views of whether President-elect Obama should be very focused on a few key issues in the first 100 days and perhaps even in the first 2 years prior to the midterm elections, or whether you think he should deal with a broad array of challenges that Governor Cuomo alluded to, but even within that, how would you prioritize? I know it's a tough question.
It is a tough question. So
Did everyone hear?
Would you, what would you suggest to Obama in writing his speech? Abraham Lincoln decided to stay with just the two big issues, and which are really one. It's a tandem, and that is slavery and what it means to the Union and keeping the Union together. Do you want to concentrate on that, or would you go into the whole series of issues that I say exist now? I think the practical thing is not to try to do the whole series, because there are just too many of them. You know, what it would come out to is a litany. I think what you need to do in that first speech, which Lincoln did so magnificently well, is state the basic rationale you have. You know, what your basic operating principle is. Are you going to be a fiercely partisan liberal Democrat? Are you going to be this or that? And this notion that, well, you're not going to be an extreme ideologue. You're going to be practical about your approach, and your approach is instead of going to war to preempt people, you know, talk first. You're going. So just state the general propositions that are going to guide you in your governance. There are some specific questions that have to be dealt with, and he's got to assure the world, not just the country, that he has a good idea as to how to manage the economy and how to get us out of this mess. Now, that's mostly in place for him already. I mean, That's being started, and by the end of his 77 days, Paulson has already gone through one change in what he was going to do with all that money. There'll probably be more changes after that. But he has to be specific, I think, on that subject. Harold would know better because Harold is himself one of the great writers of speeches, and certainly a great student of well-written speeches by Lincoln. And, what do you think? What would you say to Obama? And what parts of, Obama says he's going to use Lincoln's speeches. What parts of Lincoln's speeches do you think he should use?
Lincoln, of course, had many issues that led him to political life originally, including canals, railroads, all of those things. But from 1854 on, anyone in his party who tried to derail the conversation from slavery, he said, he used a recently discovered letter, he called it idiotic. So he was completely focused on the decision that he thought had to, as he put it, the tug has to come, and better now than ever. But I will tell you something interesting, and this is like unsolicited advice to Senator Obama. If you're angry about anything, if you're angry about something that happens in the next 30 days, if you're angry about opponents who may try to say something disagreeable, write it down in your inaugural, and we know Senator Obama's a writer too, and then get it off your chest, and then make sure you tone things down. Lincoln's the inaugural that he wrote over the grocery store, Mr. Lincoln, that inaugural was quite different from the one he delivered. He toned it down. Originally, it ended with the dare to the South, shall it be peace or a sword? And he was convinced by a series of readers that he can't do it. And it ended instead with a call to the better angels of our nature, which was much wiser. So I think it's got to go through several iterations. But I agree with you that it should focus on a couple of things. There's one back there.
Another commonality between the two, I think, would be their remarkable introspection. And it facilitated for Lincoln throughout the entirety of his life in inner direction. Do you think Obama will, and up until now, I think you could say the same for Obama, do you think in this day and age he can hold on to that inner direction, or that there's too many hammers and that he rests?
I didn't hear it.
The question is, Lincoln seemed to have inner direction and focus and the ability to be introspective. Senator Obama seems to have the same quality, but in this age of pressure and many handlers and many advisors, can he keep that inner focus? And I don't know, I would just say that I'm astonished at how many adjectives you read about Lincoln that are also applied to Obama. I'll let the governor give the prediction, but cool is a word that was used about Lincoln, and sometimes not happily. People would say he was too cool. He was distant. He was also disloyal to his political supporters. In other words, he didn't pick his hometown folks to go with him. He changed, he shed friends who weren't useful to him or the country and moved on. So there was a certain dispassionateness about him that I think there is a similarity there. I see it anyway.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, I've said this already once, let me say it a second time because I think it's so important. The one thing that strikes me as being held in common by the communicators, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and now Obama, is they speak simply. I mean, they put it together in a way that makes it sound like poetry. But the ideas are very, very simple. And you'll recall that that's what we tried to do, too. You take the basic political issue. The basic political issue is what is the role of government, okay? And Reagan comes and says big government is terrible and smaller government is better and no government would be perfect, I guess. Lincoln handles that beautifully. And it's a good example of how he thought and how he reduced things to language and even ideas that people, whether they're well-educated or not, could understand. He didn't talk about big government, little government, and getting all involved in that. He said simply, look, government is the coming together of people to do for one another collectively, that is, as a government, to do for one another collectively what they could not do as well or at all privately, which is through the market. And so translated, that is, if the market can do it for you, let the market do it. government shouldn't be the first choice. But if the market doesn't do it, then you have to get together, that's government, and do it. Now, look at how it worked. Because the Constitution never said that health care should be a right, that should have been tacked onto the Bill of Rights. Everybody has the right to get help when they're sick, and education, those two things. The Constitution never said that, and the market never provided it. And so for over 100 years, people died because they were sick and old and didn't have Medicare. Or they died because they were poor and didn't have health care, didn't have Medicaid. But it took over 100 years, to 1965, we finally decided. And education, there are still people without education. The federal government doesn't say anything about education. They help out a little bit, but they left it to the states. That's what public schools were. So that is the approach in communicating. When I wrote my first inaugural, I reduced that all into, here's what all those geniuses meant. And it's what I believe. I believe in all the government you need, but I believe in only the government you need. And that was, I think, a fair version of what Lincoln was saying, and a good example of how simple he could make things for us. And I think Obama has that same gift.
Just a quick plug and then a comment about your governorship. It's unwise from a marketing point of view, which is what I'm supposed to know about, but there's another book coming out in January called In Lincoln's Hand, which is going to be a catalog for the official bicentennial Lincoln exhibition at the Library of Congress. The highest tech reproductions of Lincoln's writings, actual handwriting, ever produced through all these great new technologies. And the co-editor and I called on leading Americans, and a couple of people who aren't Americans, from literary figures like John Updike and E.L. Doctorow and Toni Morrison to write comments, and political leaders like all the former presidents and Newt Gingrich and Mario Cuomo, and he selected that piece in its handwritten form to do. But you left out of this last litany something that Obama's going to find out. One of your most memorable phrases is that orators speak in poetry, but people have to govern in prose, and it's not as easy in a way. And people who are gifted, of people who are the most gifted orators, sometimes an unreasonable amount is expected instantaneously.
It's so much easier today to communicate, okay? I mean, you see the debate, people like, listen. You talk about Lincoln being a great orator, but how long does it take for his words to get across country to rally people? I mean, we can do it almost instantaneously. Mario Cuomo's speech at the convention, okay, was a rallying. And something you don't forget. But what did Lincoln do?
Well, it was obviously not as instantaneous, but compared to a generation earlier, it was practically instantaneous. When he speaks here at Cooper Union downtown, he goes to a party afterwards, and then he goes to the offices of the New York Tribune and reads two sets of proofs to make sure it's right. The next morning, this pool edition appears in the Times, the Tribune, the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, and one other paper that I'm now forgetting, which is bad, but all of these papers pick it up the next morning, and then, the New York Evening Post picks it up in the afternoon. And then within a week, it's in pamphlets, and it's in German, and it's in English, and it's distributed all over, reprinted. So I would say within 2 or 3 days, as was the experience with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And as a person whose words were often garbled by stenographers, Lincoln learned that he had to read the proof himself, so he was a real master and he controlled it.
Anybody else?
The expectations of Obama are very, very high. My understanding of the expectations of Lincoln were very, very low. What does this mean for the future of the success of Obama versus what happened to Lincoln?
Let me take a shot at this. I think there are, at this stage and so early, we're going to know so much more in several weeks. But right now, I see two big, of all this galaxy of big issues, but two big issues. One, good for Obama politically, maybe not for the country, but politically good for Obama. The other, dangerous for Obama. And the one is the economy, and the other is the war in Afghanistan. The economy is going to be a good issue for Obama politically in the long run, because it's absolutely clear that he didn't create the economic problem. He comes into the presidency with the problem having been loaded onto the shoulders of Bush and the last 8 years. That's the way it works. Whether that is not defensible, I don't think, in terms of logic, etc. But you get credit for good things that happen while you're there, whether you have anything to do with them or not. And you get the burden of the bad things that happen when you're there, whether you... And so I was most popular when we were making money and I could cut your taxes. I was unpopular when the economy was lousy and I raised your taxes. So that's just the way it works. So he starts with not carrying the burden of the economy himself. It is not just apt to, but I think bound to get better over the next 4 years. It's going to take a while. You won't see it next year. Maybe you'll begin to see it more the year after. But certainly by the time he's finished his 4 years, the economy will be strong again. And he will get credit for that. You know, it was bad. You made him president. Now it's good. That's good for him. Afghanistan is something else. And this is another issue that I've talked a lot about, like the religion issue, but nobody else seems to be interested in it. I think Obama made a lot of points by being against the war in Iraq, and certainly did with me and with a lot of people I know. He was against the war in Iraq. And so were most Americans and most people around the world. He then went further and continues to make points by saying, I'm going to take the forces out of Iraq and I'm going to send them home, which is the first thing he said, and which is what the Democrats said in 2006. And that's how they got power in the Congress, by saying, we're going to end the war in Iraq and bring the troops home. Well, they're not going to bring the troops home. If he ends the war in Iraq and gets the troops out of Iraq, they're going to Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan was a war we all voted for, not formally, but in our hearts, right after 9/11. But that was 8 years ago, and it was because Osama bin Laden was there, it's because Al-Qaeda was there, and it's because the Taliban were there. And so it was absolutely right to go to Afghanistan. The mistake was to, in the middle of the war in Afghanistan, when we were just getting started, to pull troops out and go into Iraq, okay? So now the war in Afghanistan is going to be Obama's war, because he's going to have to take the troops out of Iraq, and he has said it more than once, and we have to go to Pakistan, and we have to go to Afghanistan, and we have to win there. I don't know how you win there. If Al-Qaeda is hidden up in Waziristan or wherever it is in the mountains, and if they're hiding there and you send 20,000 troops their way, they're not going to stay there. They're going to leave the way they left Baghdad. They don't have a place, these terrorists, Al-Qaeda. They go wherever they have to go, Malaysia, etc. So you're not going to beat them that way. The Taliban, they're talking to, but they're a troublesome group too. And Pakistan, which we gave billions of dollars to already to Musharraf, Pakistan doesn't, most of the people there don't want us there. Now we're talking about crossing the line into Pakistan to shoot enemies because they're shooting at Americans, and the Pakistanis are blaming us for that. So it's a mess. I think that's going to be the biggest problem for Obama at the end. So the economy after 4 years is going to be good for him. The war in Iraq is maybe going to be softened, but that war in Afghanistan and Pakistan is going to be a really big burden on Obama. That's the way I see it. Now, he's got a lot of other issues in between. Health care. He has signaled that he's going to do something about health care. And this gets very complicated. Where do you get the money to do all these things? Well, let me say, we're running out of time, but let me just jam this in because I think it's a very important point. People always ask the same question: where did you get the money to do that? Well, you could get the money to fight the war. How did you get $2 trillion to fight the Second World War? How did you do that? There was a huge depression. Where did you get $2 trillion to fight the Second World War? Where did you get the $700 billion that you've just agreed to give to? And then there was $100 billion here, and there's $100 billion there. Where do you get the money? You can't do it because you have to balance your checkbook. And I couldn't do it as governor because the state has to balance its budget. But the federal government doesn't have to balance anything. It can produce dollar bills. It has a machine. Now, if I had the machine, I would use it. But I would go to jail. You know, so they use it and they get reelected. But it really comes down to this. They literally make paper. And if you do too much of it, it brings down empires. And it's the way the Roman Empire went down. It's the way all the big empires were. Paul Kennedy wrote that book on. And it's the way all the great empires have gone down. Well, then, because if you make too many bills, they get so cheap that the dollar doesn't mean anything. Become Zimbabwe, where the inflation is 150% or something like that. Now, that's the danger here. We can keep running a deficit until people say, you're not going to pay us on time in full, and so we're going to stop lending you money. The Chinese are now the biggest lenders to the United States. Chinese are the biggest lenders to the United States. And so we're running deficits, and they're giving us the money to run our government, large part of it. The Chinese were asked recently by Fareed Zakaria, he's the foreign policy guy you see now, and he's a very smart guy. And he was talking to the leader of the Chinese government, who was really the prime minister. And he was asked, he says, when are you going to stop? Are you going to stop lending money to these people? Because they're broke. You know, they had a $500 billion deficit, the Americans, last year in their budget. Why are you lending them money? He says, well, we're going to continue lending them. Why? Because they're good for it. It's just like borrowing money from the bookmaker in South Jamaica in the old days. Charlie, Rocky, I need a little money. I got to pay my rent. How much you need? $40. Well, I'll give it to you 5 for $6, but you better be here unless you want your legs broken next week. But it's the same thing with the Chinese. They said the United States is the biggest economy in the world. The United States is good for the money. The United States is going to get better. And the United States are our best customers, which we are now. We're the biggest customers. So that's the economy, and it will work its way out. We can run deficits. And despite all the talk about how bad deficits are by Republicans, Republicans are the ones who have given us the biggest deficits. Reagan gave us the biggest deficit in history in his years, and now George Bush beat him with the biggest deficit in history. But we can survive it, and Obama will survive it, and the country will survive it, and we'll be strong again because we'll get back to making money and paying our debts, and our paper will be meaningful again. But that's a very important thing to keep in. You think I confuse people with that now?
I think there won't be any more questions, that's for sure. But you know how I would leave it? I would leave it this way. I feel positive because Barack Obama is listening to Abraham Lincoln. I would feel even better if he was listening to Mario Cuomo.
No.
Okay. So Doug, anything on this one?
Yeah, let it go. And lock it up.
What's next? That's my final.
I think they want to go home now.
I think. Yeah, all right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.